What makes a three-dimensional work of art different from a two-dimensional one? Are there any particular qualities of sculpture that differentiate it as a medium? I'm Neta Bodner, an art historian at the Open University of Israel. In the next few minutes, I'm going to try and pose some answers to just that very question. What makes sculpture? Well, sculpture. To do that, I've come to the Billy Rose Sculpture Garden at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Here, I want to look at a few of the works and think about freestanding sculpture, about the viewers that walk in their midst, and about the shared space between them. I'll ask about the different ways that environment, even people within the environment like you or me who come to view the sculptures, can participate and even become a part of the work of art. Obviously, at this moment though, there's a difference between us. I'm here, I'm going to be walking amongst the works, in and around them, and you're at the home, in the office, in the train or in the traffic jam, viewing the video on a two-dimensional screen. So there's some distance to be bridged here. However, I'll tell you that studies have shown that people have the ability to imagine what materials would feel like if they reached out and touched them, without actually doing that. Or to see in your mind's eye how the garden would change if it suddenly began to rain or become very clouded, and what effect that pouring rain would have on sculptures made of different materials, like raindrops falling on wood, bronze, stainless steel, or glass. So I'd like to ask you to use those abilities and to try and engage in your imagination with the sculptures I'm talking about and walking between. And I hope that you might also have an opportunity in the near future to go out and see some works of sculpture in real life. When you do, my aim is that you'll be able to use some of the analytic tools which we'll learn in this video to enjoy, appreciate, and interpret the sculptures that you meet. So let's begin with this bronze statue, sculpted in 1880. It's the earliest of the works we'll see today, designed and molded by Auguste Rodin in 1880 or 1881, but cast in bronze only 30 years later in 1910. That makes it exactly 100 years younger than the last work that we're going to look at today together. Don't worry, I don't plan to cover 100 years of sculpture in 20 minutes. I couldn't even if I wanted to. But I do want to see the change that's characteristic of these changing eras, from very representational art like this work at the end of the 19th century, to abstraction of the human body in the beginning of the 20th century, to more conceptual sculpture in the second half of the 20th century, and almost fully abstract sculpture at the end of the century and the beginning of the 21st. So this is a generalization, but one that's quite useful for noticing the different approaches which we're going to see in the works of art we'll look at today. This work of sculpture is representational because it's showing something that we can recognize from our world. In this case, a standing naked man. Or maybe not exactly standing, maybe rising. Let's look at him closely. I see one leg bent and the other leg straight. His left arm is hanging over his right knee, and his right hand points towards his large right foot that's bent over some kind of bronze lump. His shoulders aren't straight. They're twisted as if he's moving or about to move, and his head is bent over in quite an unnatural way. So the first thing I want to do, and which I'm doing right now, with this and really with any work of art, is describe it. So first I'm looking, seeing what I'm seeing, and recounting that in words. Because looking closely and mentally checking everything I see is the first step to noticing, and therefore to analyzing, to interpreting, and ultimately, for anyone who wants to, evaluate the work. So after giving a general description of this work of sculpture, let's try and go into some of the details. If I come up close, you'll see that the depicted man is bigger than I am, larger than life-size. However, the details at the same time of his body look so convincing. See the veins on his hands or the nails on his toes? Can you imagine how the artist studied human muscles to mold the back in such a convincing manner? These bronze muscles seem to react just like human ones would to the same body position. But the muscles, unlike a painting, aren't an illusion of mass. They're made of mass. And therefore the light hits them and create different tones, different colors, lights and shades. Because here in works of three-dimensional art, in sculpture, volume isn't represented. It's made in material. All the details you see in a work like this would have been molded first into a soft material like clay, covered in a wax layer, and then recorded as hot bronze was poured into a closed case around the wax-covered clay model. The wax would have melted out under the heat of the hot liquid bronze that replaced it. And to get the small details of the human form, Rodin had to carefully work the base material and calculate the effect in the finished metal bronze that replaced the lost wax. It's a lot of work, with several preparatory stages and many moments in which such a casting process can go wrong. But once done, the material is durable and it ages beautifully. This bronze figure could continue standing here without moving for centuries, long outliving not only the artist that made it, but viewers like me who walk in its shadow. And here I want to stress, I'm literally in its shadow, because this is an important characteristic of three-dimensional art. The viewer and the work share their space. They're under the same sun or wind at the moment of viewing. I can move around this work of sculpture and shift my viewing position because this work is one of sculpture in the round, meaning it's a freestanding sculpture that's not connected to any backward surface. This means in turn that the experience of sculpture can be a dynamic one, even if sculpture itself doesn't move. And when I say dynamic, there are two types of movement that can be implied here. One is my movement around the sculpture, through which new details are revealed, and I can get a grasp of the whole only when looking from different viewing positions. The other is the only implied movement of the man that's being represented in the sculptural work. So this man's body is twisted like a spring, ready to straighten out after being tightened. If a real man stood in this position, you wouldn't expect him to hold this position for very long. You'd actually expect him to straighten up or spiral down. So molding the sculpted body with a turned torso and diagonal hands, one foot bent and one straight, gives the sense that the man's actually been caught in the middle of an action, in the midst of implied movement, despite the work itself, as I say, being fully static. However, looking not only at the implied movement, but also at the pose itself, the way that the sculptured body is standing doesn't seem fully natural. The body position that the sculpture has undertaken seems uncomfortable, if at all possible. And I wonder why the artist chose to do this. Rodin was a keen student of anatomy and movement, so any awkwardness has to be intentional. But why? Well, at this point, when I ask why, I'm transitioning from descriptive criticism, where I've looked at what I see, to interpretive criticism, where I try to kind of understand more of the content. But for interpretive criticism, we need more information. So the first relevant piece of information is the name of this work of art, Adam. Adam is the first man according to the Hebrew Bible. In chapter 2 of the book of Genesis, Sefer Bereshit in Hebrew, there's a description of man being created from the earth. The name Adam in Hebrew derives from Adamah, earth, the material from which he was created by God. Is Adam depicted here at the very moment of creation, rising for the first time from the earth from which he was made, unfamiliar with his own new limbs in the first breath of life? It almost feels as if he's unraveling his limbs for the first time, like we've caught him mid-movement, rising up from the earth, but not yet fully straight and upright. And in order to back up that interpretation, I'll tell you that this work was actually exhibited under the name The Creation of Man, and that it also visually quotes a very famous depiction of just that very moment of creation from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling in Rome. So some scholars have argued that the second arm is also a visual quote from a marble statue by Michelangelo showing the dead Christ. We could talk a lot about the different contexts that come up from such a comparison, but even without expanding on Christian theology of Christ as a second Adam and about the different interpretations that this could open up looking at this Adam, we can briefly think about the relevance of showing death as part of the image of Adam and what this means that the sculpture could be trying to convey. So after Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree of knowledge, they're expelled, as recounted in the Genesis account, from the Garden of Eden, and humanity is forever punished to an extent for their original sin. Adam was told that he and his seed, which means all of humanity, will labor and sweat to grow bread from the ground, and that he shall return to the earth from which he was made, because he was made from dust or soil, and to these after death he shall return. Some art historians see all of this story depicted here in the sculpture of Adam, so not only the moment of his rising from the earth in his creation, but also the suffering of life and the final return to earth in death. So perhaps that could be why the sculpture seems to be rising and falling at one and the same time, his limbs pushing upwards and pulling with the head and shoulders downwards, almost to the same degree. Perhaps some statement on any man's life can be imagined into the body of Adam if we wanted to push the interpretation, and we look at him at one and the same time strong and bent, stable and wavering, in quiet introspection, or rather maybe in pain. Now you'd be well within your rights to say that much of this is speculation, and it is. I don't know and can't pretend to find out what Rodin meant, and I shouldn't try to guess. But I can infer by collecting as much visual and historical data as I can, and then trying to see how many pieces of evidence in an interpretation can hang on. In this case, for example, we could consider what we know about the corresponding statue of Eve. Both works, Adam and Eve, which we don't have here at the Sculpture Garden, were meant to stand on either side of a massive representation of the gates of hell. Eve, completing Adam, was to some extent modeled after a work by Michelangelo, this time his expulsion from paradise, also on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The use of this double visual quotation for both statues suggests that this could have been an intentional and meaningful way to invite interpretation on the complete story. If we wanted to ask, and this is an aside, how the French Rodin knew these works in Rome so well in such great details in a world before internet, well, we do have record of Rodin traveling to Rome before 1880 and filling whole sketchbooks with drawings of the works of Michelangelo and Donatello. So let's see if we can now follow the same process of analysis for a second sculpture, A Woman Combing Her Hair from 1914 or 1915 by Alexander Archipenko. This work was made 5 years after Adam was cast, but 30 years after it was first modeled and exhibited. On the one hand, we can note similarities between the two works. This is also a bronze statue of a naked person, this time a woman and not a man. However, if we take time to look closely, it's clear that the approach to representing the human form is quite different. She's also standing. Her hips are tilted and her weight is on one leg with the other bent. But look at how different these legs are. If in Adam we could see every vein, every muscle, here they're shined planes with little detail, angled like geometric shapes rather than human limbs. The feet are little more than geometric slabs, and the hands, well, there are no hands. Her right arm is cut off right under the shoulder, and her left ends in a stub. Notice too that the arm doesn't bulge out as a human arm would, it collapses in, as does the top part of her neck and the right side of her chest. The hair, unlike Adam's mane of bronze curls, is marked with only 2 long squiggles, which seem to be etched into the bronze surface. And what about her face? She doesn't have one. Not of material, at least. The face is framed by the arm and hair, but is only space. It's a void, a gaping hole through which the surroundings peek through, and our imagination can complete her features. How interesting, though, that despite this abstraction, despite the half-arm, concave chest, and second arm, and such undetailed geometric planes, not to mention her not having a face, we easily recognize this to be a woman, and in my opinion, a beautiful representation of a woman at that. Alexander Archipenko, the artist who made this work, was very much influenced by the ideas of the Cubists. And one of the things that they were interested in was the extent to which a person or a thing could be abstracted and still be recognized, or how many parts of the human body can be reordered or broken into geometric planes and still come together as a unified whole, recognizable and aesthetic. For me, this is part of what the work is about, defining the shape of a woman combing her hair despite abstraction and lack of mimetic detail. It's also worth noting the extent to which this work calls attention to the space around it, and to space in general, but leaving one of the most important centers of a human being, her face, empty. Works like this one are only a step on the way to fully fledged abstract sculpture, and to even more pronounced use of surrounding space within a three-dimensional work of art. To show this, let's jump 50 years forward to 1977 and Robert Indiana's Ahava. Fully abstract sculpture veers away from representation of things, of people, or of stories. This sculpture doesn't depict a person or an object, but rather 4 Hebrew letters stacked beside and on top of one another. When read together, the letters form the Hebrew word for love, ahava. Like many works by this American artist, this one too explores the written word as a central element of artistic design. Let's look at the details. The sculpture is situated at the very edge of the garden, overlooking a wide vista of Western Jerusalem. Unlike most of Robert Indiana's work, the letters here are in Hebrew, designed for this specific location. The work is taller than human height. The large size and abstract nature of the work influences the human interaction with it. So people often sit within the sculpture, watch the view from it, or try and climb as high as they can. The large and wide letters are made out of sheets of quartz-and metal, which weathers to look a little rusty over time. Within them, space and material work together to form the letter shapes. Like a woman combing her hair, this work uses empty spaces, voids, as part of the aesthetic of the sculpture and is direct means of forming meaningful shapes. Letters in a page also have space around them, but when they're formed in 3 dimensions using metal sheets, the spaces also show the environment around them, framing trees, sky, pebbles, and the houses beyond. Such use of the surrounding space as part of the work is a tendency in art in the second half of the 20th century, in which the surroundings often become part of the work of sculpture, or are visible within and through it, in spaces left between the sculpted mass. The issue of space can even be at the core of a work of sculpture, such as in James Turrell's The Space That Sees from 1992, which is part of a series of works called Sky Spaces. So Jerusalem's Space That Sees first looks like a closed rectangle. There's no hint that it can be entered or that this is a sculptural work at all. When I finally come upon the entrance, it looks like a corridor to a room rather than a work of sculpture. Walking in, however, something tells me that this isn't a regular room. The walls and the floor are covered in local reddish limestone. Along the bottom edges is a stone bench, and the walls, they're angled to form the bench's back. The floor has 4 diagonals of its own, running towards a central point just behind me. Above that central point is a massive opening to the sky, framed by a plastered ceiling. The edges of the ceiling seem so thin. They don't look like a ceiling at all, but really like a very delicate picture frame. Only there's no picture in this frame. It's just a hole to the sky above and beyond. Or maybe this is the framed picture. The artist didn't draw this picture, but he did call our attention to it by building a frame around it and by giving us space to sit, look up, and contemplate. So unlike a painted canvas, this picture moves and changes with seasons, hours of the day, and other weather conditions. Real clouds float in and out of the frame, and birds fly through it. The artist, therefore, has provided the viewers with an opportunity to pause, to look, to contemplate, to notice the changes in the sky along with the silence of the building. The thing we're looking at and our own bodies are subject to the same influences. If it suddenly rains from up there, I'll get wet. On a sunny day, the sky will be blue and I'll be hot, and the opposite will be true of a cloudy afternoon. So the work can also emphasize the shared environment and its subtle changes. The artist James Turrell wrote that his work has no object, no image, and no focus. You're looking at you looking. What's important to me, writes Turrell, is to create an experience of wordless thought. The last work we'll look at today is Anish Kapoor's Turning the World Upside Down from 2010. This really makes one see their surroundings in a different way. It's a tall sculpture made of polished stainless steel in the rough shape of an hourglass that reflects everything around it. but the angling of the metal turns the reflections upside down, including the image of a person like me who's viewing the work. The shiny surface brings the surroundings into the visual of the work itself, so the environment is fully part of the aesthetics and the functioning of the work of art. The interesting thing with reflection, though, is that it almost cancels out the materiality of the metal itself, as if the sculpture doesn't have a material. It's like a sum of everything that reflects in it. So it's almost impossible to imagine how heavy this solid piece of metal is, because its base reflects the sky and the rays of sun bounce off it. Freestanding sculpture, so sculpture in the round, invites the viewer to walk around it and move closer and further away. This work from 2010 is fully abstract and further raises the questions which we've been considering regarding the interplay between sculpture, viewer, environment, and their common space. If we began by gazing upon Adam and his lifelike muscles, we're ending by gazing at a reflection of ourselves. If Adam's pose, including expressive contortion of the limbs, here it's our own reflection that's contorted to be upside down. This also invites the question on depiction of humans, like Adam and a woman combing her hair, versus participation by humans in such sculptures as The Space That Sees, where the viewer activates the sculpture's potential as a frame for the real world sky. If Ahava stood in front of the view of Jerusalem and gave some conceptual framework through which to think about it, love of the city, of the people, of an individual nature, I don't know, then here the city of Jerusalem forms the work, but upside down. In all cases, I hope you've managed to follow not only the ideas, but the gaze, and to imagine the size and feel of the works, allowing yourself to share their space in the garden, at least in your imagination. Thank you very much.